So we have these big question marks up on our stage, and that's because for this PM series, we are answering life's big questions. And so Pastor Jeremy kicked off our series, Answering Life's Big Questions, last week. But before I answer one of life's big questions, let me tell you what's really bothering me at the moment. What's really annoying me is that every day on my route to work, I forget that there's roadworks on Folland Avenue. Every day. And so every day, around the detour I go behind it, through the suburbs of Northgate, behind some L-plater going 20 k's an hour, and finally I come back out on Folland Avenue, and it's about 30 meters down the road, and I'm just a little bit frustrated. I remind myself, you idiot, tomorrow go the other way. And then sure enough, the next morning, I find myself turning back on Folland Avenue, around the detour all over again. I reckon in the last month, I've done that about 8 or 10 times. It's sort of everyday life though, right? Paul Tripp says that life is 2% mountaintop, 98% monotonous. You get up, you do it again. You get up, you do it again. Even your mistakes, even your detours start to look the same. And sometimes life can have this wearisome sameness about it. This kind of mundane, monotonous, wearisome sameness about it is how I might describe it. And one stark reminder of this for me was back when I used to work in government. I used to write these documents, and they were called Reds. And they were called Reds because they were printed on red paper. And these Reds, they consisted of specialist policy advice, and they were for the Premier's eyes only. Really important stuff. No one else around the cabinet table got to see this advice. And so what you have to get is this job of writing Reds amongst all the staff was seen as a really important job. And there was a bit of snobbery associated with this job. Everyone wanted this job. And so after a while, I devoted a lot of time to being able to write a really good Red. And eventually, I was able to. And all you sort of have to do is kind of learn how to use government speak. If anyone kind of works in government, you know what I mean. I sort of had to learn it when I came into church ministry as well. There's a church ministry speak as well, like let me pray for you, or what a wonderful night of fellowship we've had, and all these types of different things that we say in ministry, but we're not quite sure what they mean. Anyway, writing Reds was a big deal in my eyes. And then one day I was talking to this old guy in my office, and I was asking him for a little bit of advice about what to write in this Red, and a little bit of information about that. And he said, "Yeah, don't stress too much, mate." And he said, "They don't even read them." And I was sort of like, "What do you mean they don't even read them?" And he said, "Oh yeah, they pretty much just put a stamp on it and sign it, and it goes in the file." And I thought to myself, man, because all of a sudden started this fear in me, what I do doesn't really matter. What I do doesn't really matter. You see, work after that kind of, as you can imagine, became a bit monotonous, a bit mundane. Here I was thinking that the Premier of South Australia was hanging on every word I have to say. But it wasn't quite exactly that. What I was doing didn't seem to matter very much. And so can start the monotony of life. Stuff that you do that has a wearisome sameness about it. And not always being sure of its meaning or whether it really matters at all. Last week, Pastor Jeremy, he started with this question of meaning. You remember, he asked that question, what is the meaning of life? And what we saw in chapter 1 is that life is actually full of vanity, isn't it? A chasing after the wind. Things that are fleeting. And you've got to remember, it wasn't just momentary glimpses of vanity. It was all throughout history, there has been this sense that people have lived their lives in vain. for no good reason or purpose. Many people have lived their lives in a sea of blackness and blackness and blackness, chasing after things that they think might satisfy but find that it never does. And so history has shown this cycle of people living life at the expense of others and experiencing the effects of a broken world and having no real framework in their mind for what that means. No real understanding, no real background, no framework for what that means. You know, this lovely young Liberian girl, I'm not sure if she's here tonight, she came to my real life group on Wednesday night. And she shared how 8 of her family friends have passed away from the Ebola virus. And it's heartbreaking as she shared this with us. And thousands of West Africans woke up this morning facing the effects of this virus. You know, this morning, thousands of Christians in Iraq are just trying to work out how to survive another day. I think Joe Matthews told me the other night about the persecution going on in the Philippines, but the news doesn't even pick it up. You know, in Israel and Palestine, there's women and there's children. They're just trying to work out where they're going to take shelter today, how they're going to hide from war. You know, just this week, the most hilarious man in the world, Robin Williams, who spent his life bringing laughter and bringing joy to people, he somehow tragically came to believe that he wasn't needed anymore. Futility, meaningless, vanity of vanities. But then Jeremy posed this for us last week. What if, in the course of history, the blackness of vanity experienced an interruption? A pure interruption of darkness. A purity that was so pure that it could overcome the brokenness of this world. A moment that would change life's meaning. And Jeremy showed us that this holy interruption, it came in the form of a person. Jesus Christ, God's own Son, took upon himself the brokenness of the world, and he died to pay the debt that we could not pay to God. That is the message of Christianity. If you are here tonight wondering what the message of Christianity tonight is, that is it. It's not about morals. It's not about going to a church. It's about Jesus Christ interrupting the darkness created by us. And God therefore saying this, despite your rebellion, I offered my Son as a sacrifice, that you may know my love, that you may know my forgiveness, that you may know the absolute upholding of my righteousness for my glory, that you may know true meaning for life. Okay, we kind of get that, right? But why hasn't that gripped us? See, I'm still just waking up every day, driving the truck. I'm not really sure if that matters. I'm not really sure if that has any meaning, or I'm still waking up every day and I'm just getting on the train and I'm walking to the office and I'm writing the stuff that no one reads, or I'm just floating at the moment, or you're dealing with a really difficult situation in your life and it's just there, and then you wake up and it's just there again and it never seems to go. And the implications of it might be great, and you can't see the end of it. And sure enough, that wearisome sameness, you know what I'm talking about? That wearisome sameness comes over your life, an inability to see a way forward, the monotony of life. How do you overcome that? How do you overcome the monotony of life and live one that really matters? I know you want to live a life that really matters. I do. I want to live a life that really matters, that counts for something. I don't want to get swallowed up in the mundane. I've been there and I am there often, swallowed up in the mundane, but I really want to live a life that matters. I have 3 questions for you tonight that you can ask yourself when you are facing the monotony of life. 3 questions that I want to ask you and that you can ask yourself. Here is the first one. Why do you see life as mundane and monotonous? Why? Who here would say that you look at the events of your life, when you look at them, that you're more of an optimist? Put up your hand. Who would say you're more of an optimist? You look at life, team on. You're more of an optimist, of course you are. You see life as half full. Okay, who here would say that you're more of a pessimist? It's not a bad thing, but you're a bit more cautious, maybe you're a bit more realistic, a bit more, come on, put your hand up higher. The pessimists are sort of like, put your hand up higher, okay. That's great. Everyone's wired a little bit differently, right? Well, chapter 3 starts with a poem that Lauren read out for us that speaks to us all. And it shows us a time for one thing, and then it shows us a time for its opposite thing, which kind of captures every type of person, and opposite and oddball and every experience. And you start reading the poem and quickly you find out, man, there's heaps of stuff I'm really comfortable with here. And there's a bunch of stuff I'm not really comfortable with here at all. A time for dying, a time to weep, a time to mourn, a time to lose, a time for war. But let me speak a little bit practically, maybe to the optimists first, about how this passage might be helpful to you. Just think about this. Verse 2. While you will always look for something to be born or started, there is also a time to let something die. While you will always look to plant something and believe that it can live forever, there is also a time to pull up that droopy plant. Verse 3, while you may always think that something can heal, there is a time to get rid of things or let them be broken. Verse 4, while you may always think that you can laugh something off, there is also a time to weep and to mourn. Verse 5, while you may always embrace everything and everyone, there is also a time to refrain from embracing. Verse 6, while you may never stop searching for something or someone, there is also a time to give up on something that is over or is lost. And so it continues. Now to the pessimists. Verse 2, not everything has to die. There is a time to give birth to things. Not everything has to be plucked from the ground, roots and all. There is a time to plant and to grow. Verse 3, not everything has to be broken down all the time. There is a time for you to build up. Verse 4, mourning is not a natural state. There is a time to laugh and dance. Come to camp next Saturday night. Verse 5, there is a time to stop hesitating and to fully embrace. Now, I think we get a little bit locked in sometimes to how we've come to define ourselves. And we let that dictate our responses a bit. We take pride in our pessimism or in our optimism, or we feel defeated because we just are a certain way. When actually, there is an appropriate time for all matters and all godly responses. You know, this is a lesson I had to learn and still learn. I remember a few years ago having a few months of deep distress. And not only was I dealing with the distress, but you know what it can be like for a guy. You also have the pressure of kind of maintaining your dignity and maintaining that sense of strength and maintaining your emotions until one day I remember sitting down with Pastor Brian, and he helped me to see that though I didn't want to do something, this was a time to weep. This was a time to mourn. See, your current season of life, it may be a distressing one. You may be going through a significant time of distress. You have a desperate longing for something that you can't have. Maybe it's your work. Maybe it's your desire for a relationship, your battle with illness. It might be that you're in this in-between stage of life without any direction. Maybe you don't know why you see life with a wearisome sameness, why you see life as monotonous. But the preacher precedes his poem with a pretty definitive explanation for that. Verse 1, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. That's why you're going through what you're going through. Because there has been time set aside for this. God ordered it. Can you agree to that in your heart? God is God. You know, a few years ago when I'd really hoped for a second child for a long time, and then finally it happened only for, as I've shared with you before, it to end in a miscarriage. The biggest battle I had was to agree in my heart that God had ordered it. That God had ordered those events in my life, because the impatience and the frustration is so strong. Here's what I have come to learn, here's what I'm still learning, which is confronting when we face the monotony of life. It is confronting, but it really answers the question of why. Why do we see life this way? It's because God orders a time for everything. We want everything in our time. God orders a time for everything, but we want everything, or even just something, or even just one thing in our time. The conflict is always the same, isn't it? It's always the same. It's about the self. And that's what I notice about me, is that life becomes monotonous when I have been placed in one season, but I am demanding that I be in another one. This is the conflict. And it's unmet desire. It's about me and what I want. C.S. Lewis, he speaks a lot about this stuff. He calls it incessant autobiography. That's how he describes sin. A story about you that you are continuously telling about you. And I think that's why so often we suffer under the monotony of life, because self-obsession is boring. Have you ever spent much time with a self-obsessed person? It's boring. Ask yourself, why am I seeing life as monotonous? Is it because you want everything in your time, not the time that God has ordered? And here's what I want to recognize in front of you tonight, is that some of you may be struggling with some really intense things. I don't know what everybody is going through here tonight. Many people have deepest, dark things that they're dealing with in their heart. And it's making life a monotonous cycle for you right now. That doesn't automatically mean that you're being self-obsessed. That's not what I'm saying. But it may mean that. It may mean that. Your present season may be this: a time to die, a time to break down, a time of weeping, a time of war, a time of losing. Your current season may be one of distress. But now I want to show you what this next bit of this passage has to offer you. Not only has he ordered a time for everything, verse 11, he has made all things beautiful in its time. Man. You see, every matter is God's order, and none of it will fall to the ground. The preacher doesn't just say that God's order is final, but it kind of sucks sometimes, and it's not ideal, and that some seasons are better than others. He says that he has made all things beautiful in its time. Nothing is meaningless. From me writing stuff that no one reads, which is not really a very big deal, to your deepest trial, what is permanent and lasting is God himself and God's sovereign ordering of your life. And it is a beautiful ordering of your life. Can you agree to that? Look further. Verse 11, and he has put eternity into man's heart. So here we have this God-given awareness of what is eternal and what is meaningful. And I think that's pretty true to our experience. Most people have a curiosity. Most people have some sort of belief or understanding that there's something more than this life. But notice that there's a restraint on this understanding. There's a restraint on it. It says, yet we cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. What does that mean? It means this, that this side of eternity, we cannot fully understand what God is doing in every season of our life. But notice that even that restraint of understanding on us, He has ordered. For a reason. Two of them here, actually. Verse 12. I perceived. This is what He perceived based on that we can't know the beginning from the end. He perceived this, that there is nothing better for them than just to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Since God has not enabled us to fully understand the beginning from the end and His purpose in every season, I think that the best thing that anyone could do is to be joyful and do good in every season. The second reason, why doesn't God just tell us exactly what He's doing in every season? That would be so much easier for us. Verse 14, I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it. Why? End of verse 14, so that people fear before Him. Not a terrified fear of Him, but it means to have an awe-filled reverence for God who brings together all the pieces of your life. You see, God has even ordered that restraint on our understanding because He knows that the best thing for you is to trust and to worship Him, which is exactly what He made you for. So come before God. Come before God tonight, this week, and surrender your desire to be in a different season than you are in. Say a radical thing. Say, God, thank you for this season. It's beautiful in its time. It's beautiful the time that you have given to it. I'm going to own it because you ordered it and I trust you. Are you suffering in the monotony of life? A wearisome sameness? Ask yourself the heart-exposing question, why? Why are you viewing life this way? Is it that though God has ordered this time for me, I want everything in my time? Surrender that. From verses 16 to 22, you see this return to the vanity of vanities, the vanities of life that Jeremy was talking about last week and showed us in chapter 1 and 2. And our lives are from dust to dust, and they return to dust. And the picture of the finality of life, and it draws us to think about what is most important. And here is the second heart-exposing question. The first one is why. The second one is, what does my life show is most important to me? What does your life show is most important to you? There is an epidemic going around of people who quite clearly say what is the most important thing to them, but then do the complete opposite. We say, my wife and children are the most important thing to me, but then we work so much that we don't have time for them. I mean, I have to confess, I'll spend a whole day at work, and then I'll come home a bit late, and then when I get home, I have this urge to get my laptop out, and my iPad out, and my phone out, and do more work, and plan more things, and it's great, and it's in a ministry context, so it's kind of like in the name of Jesus. But I think that what it's really showing is neglect and idolatry and control. What good would it be for me to say for the rest of my life, the most important thing to me is my wife and children, but then at the end of my life, them say, he didn't really spend much time with us? What good would that be? We say My highest priority is to grow spiritually, but then we never spend any time with God. I reckon in my early 20s, I spent probably 3 or 4 years without even touching my Bible. But I was still keeping up the appearances, saying, yeah, I want to grow spiritually. We say prayer is so powerfully important, but then we don't pray for anyone. We say spending time with friends is the most important, but when we're with them, we're on our phones on Facebook. We say that something needs to be done about the poor, but we don't do anything. We say a lot of things. But what does your life show is most important to you? Because the disconnect between what you say and what you do will be a factor in whether you see life as monotonous and living a life that really matters. In chapter 4, the preacher shows what life is like without God, basically. He shows a picture of what becomes most important to humanity when they're left to their own devices. Verse 1-3, the oppression of people, living life at others' expense. He saw that there was no one to comfort the oppressed. Is there something that is so important to you that you will step on anyone to get it? Verses 4-6, he saw work and rivalry. And boy, did this verse stick out to me. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work came from a man's envy of his neighbor. I get the feeling that the preacher is feeling this sense of disgust here. He's looking like his stomach is turning at the thought of everyone just kind of refining their skills and talents solely from the motivation of being envious of their neighbor. This is pure evil. Verses 7-8, he saw greed, eyes that are never satisfied with their riches, with what we have and how we still grumble about it. Man, we should be ashamed. Verses 9-12, he sees isolation. Woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Woe to those of us who decide, I'm going to do life my way. I'm going to do it on my own with no dependency on anybody else. Verses 13-16, he sees this continual instability through worldly wisdom of a king who tickled the ears for a while of people, but in the end it didn't last because it meant nothing. And again, the morbid sentence at the end of chapter 4, surely this is also vanity and a striving after the wind. So what does your life show is most important to you? Do you need control? Do you need power? Are you a workaholic? Are you caught up in rivalry, in greed? Are you isolating yourself in this self-sufficiency? The point is, if you say that God is most important to you, but your life shows otherwise, that disconnect is going to create a monotony in your life where you will not be able to clearly see meaning. If what you say and what you do doesn't line up, that will create a disconnect. It will create this sense of alienation in your mind. What am I doing? What's going on? This conflict, this internal conflict. Surrender your desire to be in another season. Thank God for the season that you're in. And then reevaluate what is truly most important to you. And put God at the center of it. Third question, last question. Ask yourself, what does God show is most important to him? Have you asked yourself that question lately? What does God say is most important to him? God, in this season right now, what is most important to you? I mean, do we always just chatter amongst ourselves, trying to come up with the answers, and never actually say that? God, what is most important to you? I'll tell you what I do in the hard seasons. I make deals with God. And I'm like the best deal maker around with God. And I'll show you what I mean. God, here is the sacrifice of some promised holiness in exchange for you passing the season by. What a great deal. It's pretty lame before God Almighty. There's actually a song that I've written about this that is going to be on this album that we're putting out. And the lyrics go, when everything I'd planned to do made everything you'd planned for me more like just a friend's advice, not suited to my life, then I'd put down a deal or two. An offer God surely couldn't refuse, all the blessing for all my needs, an exchange for my good deeds. But how often do we just come and say, God, in this season, what is most important to you? No deals. What is most important to you? Well, chapter 5, verse 1 to 7. It could be said straight from his heart to yours. So I want you to follow along in your Bibles, read along, and I'm going to paraphrase this. Chapter 5. My child, guard your steps when you come before me. Draw near and just listen. I don't need your sacrifice if it doesn't mean much. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be quick to utter a word before me. For I am God in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. When you make promises to me, keep them. For I have no pleasure in fools. It would be better if you didn't vow than if you make me a vow and break it. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before angels, it was just a silly mistake. Why bother promising something you can't keep and so be judged for it? When dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But I am the one you must worship. I want to tell you guys tonight, for those of you who are suffering under the monotony of life, for those of you doing the stuff day by day by day that just doesn't seem to have any meaning or really matter at all, you will live a life that matters by living for the things that matter to God. You will live a life that matters by living for the things that matter to Him. I said earlier that life is 2% on the mountaintop, 98% monotonous. So where is God really asking us to grow in our love and devotion? It's in that stuff. It's in the monotony. It's in the day by day by day. I want you to take a look at the poem once more in chapter 3. And note the first line and the last line. The sort of bookends of this poem. A time to be born and a time to die. Last line, a time for war and a time for peace. You see, you have this alignment here between being born and being at war, and then between death and peace. It's how the poem starts and ends. You see, everything I've been talking about tonight basically reveals that as soon as you're born, what begins? A war. A war begins. A war begins for the state of your heart and who's going to control it. And all the things in between the first and the last lines of the poem, they're all the events in which we really show who is most important to us. Every person has a choice. Will they be at war with the God who made them, or will they accept his terms of peace? That when they die, they may really know the everlasting peace of God. God's peace offering to a warring heart is his Son, Jesus Christ, who had his own time to be born. He had his own time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to experience all the monotony of life, and also a time to die, ultimately laying himself on the altar as God's peace offering for all of us, that we might live, that we might know his peace. That even in our death, we may not continue in war with God for eternity, but we might one day experience peace in its fullest measure. There is a God-ordered time for such peace. Amen? There is a God-ordered time for that. So, you will live a life that matters when you live for the things that matter to God. And what matters to him most is that you've accepted his terms of peace. That's what matters to God. Have you accepted his terms of peace? Jesus. And made it your ambition to worship him no matter the season. That's how we face the monotony of life and live a life that really matters. Perhaps you need to let your words be few before God. Let him ask you and search you on these questions. My child, why are you seeing life this way? My child, what is most important to you? My child, my son Jesus has offered you peace with me. And in my sovereignty, I have ordered every season of your life for your good and for my glory.